Hello, everyone. It's Eric from Strong Medicine and Stanford University. Today, I'm excited to discuss some AI related research of which I've been privileged to have been part. This video will have several segments. I'll briefly discuss the methodology and results of two closely related papers, one which came out in JAMA Network Open in October and which got some media buzz. For example, here's one of our authors, Adam Rodman, talking about it on CNN. The second one was just published in Nature Medicine last week. Then I'll be joined by two of my co-authors, Dr. Ethan Goh from Stanford and Dr. Hannah Kerman from Beth Israel Deaconess, in a discussion of the implications of our findings. And I'll end with a brief epilogue about a recent preprint by some of our group, which adds even more information to this topic by examining the performance of OpenAI's O1. But first, I want to start with a story as to how this research came about in the first place, because it's a good demonstration of how research works. You don't start with the biggest and most important question. Instead, you start with something small, and you build up from there. Why? For one thing, the big questions require funding, and those providing the funds, they want to be sure that your hypothesis has merit, and that you can deliver what you're promising. In addition, though, when you start small, you learn stuff that will incrementally strengthen your methodology or even refine the hypothesis you test in the next step. In short, the small exploratory research makes what follows higher quality and more likely to be successful. When ChatGPT was first released 2 years ago, everyone was immediately curious as to what it was capable of doing. As an educator, one question that popped into my head was whether it could pass one of the clinical reasoning final exams we give to our students here at Stanford. Although ChatGPT had quickly been shown to be able to pass a variety of multiple choice tests like Step 1 of the USMLE, our clinical reasoning exams consist of lengthy vignettes followed by free response questions. It is a very different kind of examination than Step 1. Now, in 2025, today that is, it probably seems obvious it would pass. But in January 2023, it was definitely not obvious. So I gave it a try. I found out it passed, and I posted a video about it here. But that was just proof of concept. It was not a rigorous scientific study. For that, I was going to need help. I found some colleagues here at Stanford who have been wondering similar things about AI and chatbots. We put together a small but formal study to grade multiple runs of ChatGPT's performance on previous final exams and compare that to our students' historical performances. We found that ChatGPT Plus, built on GPT-4, didn't just pass the exams. On average, it modestly outperformed our students. But by the time that paper was published, it was no longer all that interesting a scientific question. A comparison of the clinical reasoning ability of student versus AI seemed like old news. Around the same time, there were several studies that compared physicians versus AI, which was getting closer to a more relevant question. A comparison between physician versus bot versus physician using the bot. For that study, we at Stanford were going to need even more help, and we found physicians and scientists at other institutions who were interested in that same question. Soon, we had a collaboration between Stanford, Beth Israel Deaconess, the University of Minnesota, and the University of Virginia. This was the start of the Arise Healthcare Network, a new initiative that is examining the intersection of AI and clinical medicine. Dr. Goh, who is joining us in a few minutes, has played an integral role in getting this off the ground. The rest of this video will talk about two of the major papers that have come out of that collaboration. Ones which sought to answer the questions, does AI help physicians make more accurate diagnoses? And does it help them make better management decisions? These two papers use similar methodology, but for clarity, I'm going to talk about them one at a time. Here's the first, the diagnosis paper. Large language model influence on diagnostic reasoning in JAMA Network Open. The primary question this paper was seeking to answer: does the use of an LLM improve physicians' diagnostic reasoning as compared with their use of conventional resources? We recruited 50 physicians in internal medicine family medicine and emergency medicine at Stanford, Beth Israel Deaconess, and UVA. There were 26 attendings and 24 residents. Almost all were in internal medicine. Prior experience with LLMs was relatively equally distributed across the board. These 50 physicians were randomized in a 1-to-1 ratio to either use ChatGPT running with GPT-4, in addition to whatever conventional resources they typically access during clinical care, or to use conventional resources only. The conventional resources included things like UpToDate, PubMed, and even Google, though the data collection predated its AI overview feature. The participants were then given 1 hour to read up to 6 clinical vignettes and to answer questions related to the differential diagnosis for each case. These vignettes were adapted from a pre-existing set of actual patient cases that have been previously used as a standard for computer-based diagnostic systems. These cases have never been publicly released to protect their validity for future use, and thus could not have been part of an LLM's training data. These cases were selected to represent a variety of diagnoses and clinical settings, with final diagnoses that were neither common nor exceedingly rare. The questions for each case were divided into 3 parts. In Part 1, participants were asked to list 3 possible diagnoses, including key features, which support and which refute each one. Part 2 asked the participants to commit to a single most likely diagnosis, and Part 3 asked for up to 3 additional next steps in the diagnostic process. Correct answers were predetermined by a consensus of board-certified physicians who validated the assessment tool with 2 sets of pilot data that allowed for iterative refinement and which were not included in the final analysis. Answers could be awarded partial credit. They were graded independently by 2 blinded scorers, with disagreement in scoring resolved by consensus between them. The primary outcome was final score as a percentage. Secondary outcomes were the time spent per case and the accuracy of the final diagnosis in isolation. Let's see the results. The median number of cases completed within the hour was 5 per participant. The median score per case was 76% for the LLM group and 74% for the control group. This difference was not statistically significant, nor is the difference in median time spent per case, nor the accuracy of the final diagnosis. Although the numbers start to get small, subgroup analysis of attendings versus residents and more versus less prior experience with LLMs did not suggest any differences between those groups either. So, to return to the primary question, does the use of an LLM improve physicians' diagnostic reasoning? The answer is no, at least not when using GPT-4. However, if that was the whole story, I don't think this paper would have been discussed on CNN or in the New York Times. That came about because of one additional step we took. We looked at what ChatGPT would have scored if it was used alone with the minimum possible human input. That is, if a user blinded to the diagnoses were to simply enter each case into ChatGPT, unaltered, followed by the same set of questions. The results of this were that ChatGPT's median score per case was 92%, which was statistically better than either physician group. This is what was so surprising. ChatGPT alone outperformed physicians using ChatGPT. Next, paper number 2, the management paper. GPT-4 assistance for the improvement of physician performance on patient care tasks in Nature Medicine, published last week. The primary question this paper sought to answer: does the use of ChatGPT improve physician performance on open-ended management reasoning tasks compared to the use of only conventional resources? The methodology was very similar to the diagnosis paper. We recruited 96 physicians, the majority of whom were attendings and were in internal medicine. They were randomized once again in a 1-to-1 ratio to ChatGPT plus conventional resources or conventional resources alone. 5 clinical vignettes were adapted from the recurring Gray Matters segment of the ACP podcast Core IM. The hallmark of these cases was that they were complex and unique enough that their optimal management was not a matter of simply referring to guidelines. They all had inherent nuances. To create an assessment of management reasoning, Each case was reviewed by a panel of generalists and relevant subspecialists who created and iteratively revised clinically relevant questions and the range of acceptable answers. As before, they were tested with 2 pilot groups and further refined with feedback from both pilot participants and the graders. Also, as with the diagnosis paper, we ran each case and the questions through ChatGPT with minimal human input multiple times, which were then included for blinded grading alongside the human responses. The primary outcome was the mean score. Secondary outcomes were the time spent per case and the likelihood and extent of possible harm based on the suggested management steps. So, what were the results of this one? Physicians randomized to use ChatGPT performed better than the control group and the same as ChatGPT alone. However, physicians randomized to ChatGPT, they also spent a statistically significant greater length of time per case. There was not significant differences in the likelihood or extent of harm between the physician using ChatGPT versus the control group. There was a concern that physicians using ChatGPT might score higher simply by including longer responses, since our assessment tool rewarded correct answers but did not directly deduct points for incorrect answers. When scores were adjusted based on the character count of the responses, the difference between the physician plus ChatGPT arm versus the control arm was reduced, but it was still present. To return to this study's primary question, does the use of ChatGPT improve physician performance on open-ended management reasoning tasks compared to the use of only conventional resources? The answer was yes, it did, with these cases and using this admittedly novel assessment. So as an oversimplified summary of these 2 studies in one slide, with diagnostic reasoning, a physician using AI was no better than a physician without AI, but AI alone was better than either. And in management reasoning, a physician using AI was better than a physician not using AI, but the AI alone was just as good. And with that, let me bring in 2 of my co-authors to discuss these results and the broader implications of this kind of work. Okay, well, joining me today, we have Dr. Hannah Kerman. She's a hospitalist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and a lecturer at Harvard Medical School. She attended Brown University for undergrad and medical school and completed her internal medicine residency at Beth Israel Deaconess. And we have Dr. Ethan Goh, is a Stanford healthcare AI researcher. Prior to Stanford, he was an internal medicine clinician, startup founder, and technology consultant, working with partners like Google, OpenAI, and the UK's National Health Service. He holds an MD from Imperial College London and a master's in clinical informatics and management from Stanford. And Ethan was one of the first authors for both of these papers, and really led the effort along with Dr. Rob Gallo. And so we are indebted to his dedication to getting these papers and this whole project off the ground and completed. So thank you both of you for being here. Yeah, let's get started.
Yeah, excited.
So let's ask, so the channel viewers, they've already heard the results. I've already presented, what we found with both ChatGPT's ability to make diagnosis and offer management recommendations. What surprised you guys about these results? Or were you surprised? Maybe you weren't, but if you were, what was surprising about them?
Yeah, so I think in some of the earlier studies, and like everyone else, right, most of us would expect that doctors given computers, given AI would do a lot better. And indeed, that was the signals we were getting in earlier pilot phases. So I think that was definitely the most surprising when we came out to do the study, even though other results, secondary outcomes, got all the headlines around AI alone. But really, we wanted to study the effects of doctors using what they are on a day-to-day basis versus doctors using AI tools. And we expected very much that using AI, maybe they are faster, better, but that wasn't what we found. And I think to us, that was the most surprising.
Yeah, I think just to add on that, it was very surprising the difference that AI alone, sort of in quotation marks, did so much better than AI plus a human physician. And I think, it begged this question. What is that difference? How is having a human doctor who's done a lot of training, how is that slowing the AI down sort of in the diagnostic sphere specifically? And then I think also when looking at the management paper as well, it brings up the question of what's the difference in the management context? Why are the scores, why is AI and a physician plus AI sort of doing more equivalent in the management space? And we can talk more about sort of theories on what the difference was there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess we can get into that, Hannah, since you just brought it up. Like, why do you think there was a difference?
I think that like this, to me, this is like one of the essential questions from the paper. And we ended up doing a qualitative study. It's in submission right now, sort of trying to talk to people and draw out how are they using it? Can we learn something about how people are thinking about this tool that can explain this difference at all? I mean, and the answer is no. Like we can't get a perfect answer, but we can maybe get some insights. I think like the two things that come up for me, and Ethan, I love to hear what you think, are one is, people weren't trained on this tool and that the importance of not just prompting, but also like clearing. Like I think, the more I've learned about using these LLMs, like through the process of being a part of this research group, I'm not sure that people were always using it to its optimal ability, and that like sort of like adding lots of information on top of each other. And then the other piece I think is much more psychological of like how people come up with diagnosis and using this tool to sort of confirm what they were already thinking. But you could imagine an AI tool that actually asks you questions and helps you like not just to say, oh yeah, this information kind of adds up to what I was thinking, but makes you question, what am I missing here? Which is not really how the tools are set up at this point.
Yeah, no, great points. Fully agree. I think to me, the two main things, right? Two T's, training and trust, right? So this idea of like, hey, we really wanted to study how much doctors would out of the box, right, use this tools because that really reflects reality, right? Stanford, Beth has shown lots of these cases, getting a lot of access to GPT with minimal training like doctors and most tools. So similar in our study, we had minimal kind of onboarding. We had a proctor around to sort of suggest, talk through steps, instructions if they got stuck. But not so much as, not a very didactic, hey, this is how you use it. Steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's the first part, training. Second part, Hannah also alluded to trust, right? Like if there's a tool, but I have no idea, where the sources are coming from. And indeed, it's known to hallucinate and all of that stuff. I imagine as a human physician, and again, Hannah did lots of good follow-up work and qualitative studies, right? But as a human physician, I'm going to be always second guessing and, all this cognitive anchoring bias are going to play a huge effect there. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. Please go ahead, Hannah.
Oh, I just want to add that, I think that trust is a big part, but I guess I just also want to say that I don't think that the LLM was always right and like doctors were always throwing out the wrong answer. I think it's sort of a little bit more complicated than that. Sometimes people were throwing out the wrong answer. But sometimes also the LLM was not bringing up the right answer in the context of working with a physician and like why that happened, why it was able to bring up the right answer pretty consistently in the like GPT alone scenarios, but not with a physician. It's something both about trust and about the sort of user LLM interface.
I'm going to pull up a quote from one of our co-authors, Jonathan Chen, who I came across this in a paper, like a news article. Quote, they were treating ChatGPT like a search engine for directed questions. Is cirrhosis a risk factor for cancer? What are possible diagnoses for eye pain? Only a fraction of the doctors realized that they could literally copy and paste the entire case history into the chatbot and just ask it to give a comprehensive answer to the entire question. Only a fraction of the doctors actually saw the surprisingly smart and comprehensive answers the chatbot was capable of producing. But, Hannah, something you just suggested makes me think about another way to approach using a chatbot, which is not like as a data dump or as like a static resource, but actually as like a conversation. Like I don't know if maybe ChatGPT doesn't do this. I mean, it's not capable of doing this, but actually having a dialogue a physician. Like, I think about like how you would, if you were seeing a case or talking about a case with a colleague, an actual human colleague, and you ask your colleague, well, what do you think this case could be? And the colleague says, oh, I think it could be X, Y, and Z diagnosis. The colleague would now ask, what do you think it is? And you'd say, well, I think it's ABC. And they say, why do you think it's ABC and not X, Y, Z? And you actually would have a back and forth discussion about it versus with ChatGPT. And at least the way people, even the way that Dr. Chen here, Jonathan is suggesting that would be optimal. It's still like you ask ChatGPT the answer, it gives you the answer. And then that's you're sort of done. You either take it or you reject it based on your confirmation bias, anchoring bias, or on your own sort of lack of strong opinion on the case yourself. There's no back and forth discussion. And I don't know if you guys have ever actually attempted to do that, like actually prompted ChatGPT to make you defend your own answer. I have actually not tried that. I'd be curious to see whether or not that actually improves the doctor AI dyad at all.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of point there, right? Because whether it's a patient, whether it's a doctor, trying to interact with it, you don't really have to sort of, with a patient, right? Like as doctors, you ask clarifying questions, you try to say stuff like, did you mean this? And kind of ChatGPT, at least how it's programmed, right? Because all this is programming, prompting on the back end, which we don't see as a user interface. All of that is just, really, like you said, right, Eric? Like it's just meant to provide a very certain response that at times obviously is going to get it quite wrong. And I think just to share as well on an anecdotal level, right, outside of healthcare, when I interact with any sort of these chatbots, what I've noticed is that you can lead it down directionally very wrong paths, right? And that depends largely as well on how much information you give upfront. And what I feel is that when I get a really good response, it's a lot about this sort of, hey, I put on clarifying points to get to where I want to get to, right? And I think that is potentially, what could both cause like so many doctors working with AI to get things badly wrong, and also speaks to the potential of like what you mentioned, right, Eric? If there's a way to ask clarifying questions, then interaction working together with the doctor AI chatbot, that could result in a lot better performance and outcomes.
I've heard rumors that there is studies going on sort of with a model that's specifically built and to ask questions. I think you can ask GPT 4 and 4.0 questions and sort of get some back and forth, but it's not necessarily like built into it on the back end. And that's sort of beyond my purview. But yeah, I think there's sort of active attempts to create a kind of co-pilot interaction that's sort of like talking to your colleague that you trust. That's like, okay, does this make sense? Can you run this back with me? Like, what am I missing here? And that seems really exciting to me because it speaks to some of the, psychological things that are, of course, always a part of how we come up with like diagnosis and management responses, because we have to narrow things down. We have to sort of pull from our knowledge. And so, there are times when we miss things. And so we have to use these tools to not miss things. Yeah, so that seems really exciting.
Yeah, and I do think if there's a model that allows the physician to use ChatGPT more as a co-pilot and less as an information resource, do you think that would increase the trust in ChatGPT and eliminate some of this problem with confirmation bias?
That's a great question. I think the thing about trust and, without giving away too much about our, manuscript that's in submission for the qualitative pilot is, people's amount of trust in GPT wasn't based on how much they knew about GPT. It was about their own level of training and how comfortable they felt in their own medical knowledge. And there was this really interesting divide between younger physicians who were like, this is going to take my job, and older physicians who were like, I'm using resources all the time. Like, this is one piece of a set of resources, and I'm filtering this through my own knowledge the same way I would any other set of resources. But I think that speaks to the fact that that piece I don't see as movable, based on sort of whether or not it questions you. That piece is sort of based on sort of how much people trust themselves and whether or not they see this as a partner or as like something like Google or as a book, and how we conceive of the information sources before us and how much we trust those overall.
At the time of this filming, just for our viewers, that the management paper is not yet out in publication. So I can't talk too precisely about it per se, and we don't know what the public's reaction to it's going to be. But I will say the public had an interesting reaction to the diagnosis paper, in that I think the takeaway message for a lot of laypersons and a lot of reporters even was that ChatGPT outperformed doctors. And then that naturally extended into, why bother talking to your doctor about a diagnosis if you just plug your case into ChatGPT and get the answer? What good are doctors for diagnostic purposes? What do you guys? I mean, I'm sure you saw some of that media coverage. Like our co-author Adam was on CNA getting interviewed about this specific point, about whether or not, like, the takeaway message is ChatGPT is better than doctors at making medical diagnoses. Is that a fair takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, very provocative title, right? Obviously, I think that led to a lot of discussion, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But I think, as with any sort of studies, right, there's always all this, asterisks and limitations and caveats that it's quite difficult and nuances for mainstream media to capture. And, just addressing that question, right? Hey, can patients or should patients just use a chatbot, right, instead of visiting a doctor? I think we already touched on the aspect that, hey, actually, chatbots are not very good at doing things like asking clarifying questions, which doctors are susceptible, right, to, hey, going down this tunnel, which might not be the right direction. Patients are even more, right? And that could lead to some alarming missed red flags, unnecessary worry, so on and so forth. So I think that's one of my main initial reactions. I'm sure Hannah has lots of good thoughts and responses there to say as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I totally agree, Ethan. And I think, the idea that, like, AI beats doctors, I find a little frustrating. But I can, they were really impressive results from the diagnostic paper. I think you can't deny that. I think what that told me was not like, give up on doctors, only, get your medical information from AI. It's like, wow, this is a really powerful tool. It's a really powerful tool, especially, it seems like, in the diagnostic setting. How do we harness it, I think, still remains to be seen. I also think, something that is important is, like, the way, and, a big critique of the study was that these were cases that were cleaned and sort of, like, very available. And one of the skills that you learn as a doctor is, like, how you're getting information, which, first of all, I'm sure that AI can be taught how to, ask, like, questions about the interview, but sometimes patients don't know always what is, like, the right information to provide. And part of that interaction as a doctor is, like, how to draw out in a way where you're, like, seeing the human before you, what is important about the big problem that they're telling you they're having. And so that seems like a really important thing that's, like, not covered in this paper, and a reason why I don't think it is safe to use AI as a medical professional at this point. Although I don't know if you guys saw, there's, like, a bill that's out there, Bill 238.
I think they introduced it.
And are you referring to the one that was going to allow AI tools to actually write prescriptions?
To be a prescriber. Yeah.
That strikes me as a bill that's probably not going to make it out of committee. It's probably a little bit too extreme. But the fact that, like, an actual elected politician on the national stage thinks that that's a good idea is a little alarming. I don't know.
Yeah,
I agree.
So I was going to say, to add on, right, just to add a bit of color. So very recently, I think a few weeks ago, my sister, asked me a couple of medical questions, as you do, right? She's non-medical. And I think for most of us, at least one medical folks, right? Yourself, Eric, Hannah, you probably ask by relatives, right? Hey, given this situation, what should I do? I think she was asking me a question about her kid with some sort of, like, flu-like symptoms. And so I was like, hey, let's just pop into ChatGPT and see what it says. And as it turned out, the results, everything from the possible differentials to the management, what to do, rest versus seeing doctor, super reasonable, right? So what I did was I copy-pasted her response back into WhatsApp and sent it to her. And she was like, if I wanted AI response, I would just have gone to it, right? And what I really wanted is your feedback experience. And so so what I did then was, like, okay, all this seems reasonable, but amongst all these things, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Here's how I'll think about it. Maybe start with this one, do that one. And she was like, all right, that's what I really wanted, right? I don't actually know what that speaks to, but maybe it's a bit of element of like, hey, there's human communication experiences of physicians that a chatbot doesn't really have. This layer of intersection, right, of not just information, but also teasing out what are maybe the more important nuances from that, broad amounts of information that a chatbot can clearly give much more comprehensively than a doctor in like just 3 minutes. So again, like say you or me wanted to go and get a lawyer consult, right? All that text encyclopedia is online, right? We could easily do that, but which one to apply, what sort of rules, what direction to take. These are things that probably we lack kind of the expertise to do. And maybe a chatbot might get quite good one day, but even then, a lot of what it puts out is a lot of signals you feed in, right? So if you're feeding in, say, the wrong thing or wrong route to pursue legally or medically, right, it's very likely it's going to not lead to an ideal outcome. So yeah, I mean, just to share like, hey, tying back to real life examples and how I'm handling those things.
Yeah, no, I think that actually brings up an interesting thing I was thinking about, comparing the diagnosis paper and the management paper, which I think both of you sort of talked about at the very beginning with what we're surprised about the results, the fact that ChatGPT outperformed doctors using ChatGPT with diagnosis, but not when it came time to management. And I wonder if that's because what diagnosis they have based on their symptoms is going to be, I mean, taking into consideration their demographic, their age and gender and stuff like that. Like they're going to have some role, some influence, but not nearly as much as when deciding like, what is the next step in management? Is this a patient that you should, keep in the hospital to biopsy that, incidentally discovered lung mass? Or is this a patient you should discharge home and schedule outpatient follow-up? That's way more context dependent. And AI may just struggle with knowing how to give a response within the context of the very specific situation. And that's sort of related to also, we were talking about like maybe different people just want different kinds of information, right? And such that if the chatbot has no idea what information you want, just spews out this giant body of text, it may all be accurate, may all be good information, but if it's not what the individual who's absorbing the information wants to know or it wants to focus on, that's going to be a shortcoming of the chatbot versus a live human who might be able to hone in on what specific information that the patient is interested in. What's the next step? Where do researchers in this space and the intersection between AI and clinical medicine, where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think one is something interactive that can sort of ask questions and have that back and forth, say, get people to question their diagnosis. I think it's really interesting. I think a really important thing is going to be trying to figure out how useful are these tools in like live patient cases, which obviously is incredibly complicated and ethically sticky. But using it on sort of like unclean cases, someone who's coming from the ED or still gathering information, is going to be really important to see how functional, how useful is it in a case where there's not a clear answer. How can AI perform in those scenarios? Can it help physicians in those like real life situations? I think it's a big next step.
Yeah, so I'm super excited, right? Like most of the researchers. And in my view, I think that there are 3 areas as for what a lot of research groups are going to do or thinking or already working on. The first one, around training and trust, right? What sort of education, what sort of training to allow doctors to understand, hey, what's a hallucination, when you can trust this chatbot, so on and so forth. That should probably theoretically, right, address the sort of training trust components. And already I also know a lot of medical schools, right, are trying to figure out for the next generation, right, how do we introduce some sort of AI medicine curriculum? The second part is, again, one of the critiques of the study, right? Like, hey, these were all simulated cases, vignettes, presented information very nicely. And like Hannah said, right, what would be the more real life proxy of using these things, right? How could you deploy it in a way that is safe enough so that it passes IRB, patients do get standard of care, but is going to reflect more of how medicine is actually practiced. And the third area for me is around technology, right? So again, LM is a very new technology, but hey, our lab, informatics, they've been working on a lot of this more traditional, right, quote unquote, ways of using a big data mining approach to build more predictive engines. When I say predictive, I mean that unlike a black box, non-explainable, you knew what data went in, you know what data comes out, you can track the performance. And so I'm super excited about the potential of combining, predictive AI technology with some of this large language generative AI models. So one specific example would be we are working on an e-consult solution for a primary care physician to consult with a specialist and get an immediate response. And one way of doing what we can today, which we couldn't in the past, was that the lab train a model to predict what sort of medications a specialist would most likely order. But with Gen AI today, you can inject citations, references on top of that to sort of summarize, explain, where the suggestions are coming from, right? So I think that's one area example of like, hey, if there's lots of exciting opportunity to start combining some of these technologies to really make the practice of medicine more joyful and, really improve the outcomes of doctors always trying to do the best things for the patient.
Yeah, can I add one thing to that? That's great, Ethan. I think something that is present in when people are going to AI saying like, I don't need doctors. I just want an answer here, is the way that the medical system as it stands right now can make people feel like not seen, not heard, not getting the care that they need. And so I hope, and I want to envision a way that having these tools doesn't add just like more automation and chat boxes, but adds more spaces for us to sort of like focus on the human project of caring for people, like understanding what diseases are in front of us, catching dangerous diseases, reassuring people when we figure out something is actually relatively benign. And I'm excited about that project and the power that AI has, but I'm also pretty worried because I think there are a lot of incentives that go against sort of increasing that human connection and human element and move towards sort of creating more space to say like a robot could do this for you. And I worry that won't actually be safe.
Yeah. I was just going to add on. I remember when, Hannah did amazing work with the group. When she first joined, she was like, I'm super skeptical and, about all this stuff. And that's why I'm joining. And I love that, right? Because it was versus me, Adam, John, like, who were all this techno-optimists, like, oh, wow, AI can do this stuff, right? So, I just thought it was amazing to have, Hannah's kind of insights feedback, because I think that's what's necessary, right? You need, on one hand, people who are pragmatic, like, hey, what about this and that, versus people like, hey, let's push the boundaries. And I think with that kind of mix of clinicians, technologists, researchers, that's how you can really get towards like, hopefully an ideal outcome of how AI, doctors could work together. So, yeah.
Yeah, so something that I was struck by when I was looking through comments in the aftermath of the diagnosis paper publication and the media discussion around it, is when you look through the comments on Reddit and comments to some YouTube videos about the paper, there's a lot of people that talked about the fact that they're ready for AI to replace their doctor because their doctor doesn't listen to them, or because their doctor is biased against what their people of their identity, whether it's women, whether it's a racial minority, etc. And I was struck by the fact that, wow, like that was, it wasn't the majority of comments.
Yeah.
It was enough that there was a signal there that that's a problem, and that if there's a way that we can make sure that incorporation of AI into our workflow with patients improves the patient experience with the physician and trusts us more, and makes us more empathetic and makes us less biased. Like, we need to like embrace that, because otherwise, like, patients are just going to gravitate more towards AI. If they think AI is going to be more trusting, if they think AI is going to be less biased, I think AI is going to be more willing, so to speak, to spend essentially an infinite amount of time talking to them. That's going to be a problem. It's really hard to I guess outperform that if we don't make a concerted effort to address those concerns of a non-trivial number of our patients.
Yeah. And they're real concerns, right? Like the medical, the history of medicine is just full of that being true time and time again. And, also the pressures on human doctors who like need to sleep and eat and like, have weekends off every once in a while to spend time with family, in a system that's sort of driving more RVUs. Like, yeah, people are going to have less time to talk with their patients. So yeah, how do we counter that instead of intensifying it? Especially when it's like AI is not neutral, it is an amazing tool, but like, it's owned by companies, like their underlying, goals that they have. Some align with a human project of health, and some that's like not the main goal. So I think it's really important for us to recognize that and do what we can, to sort of engage patient trust, like both with AI, but as human physicians.
Yeah, well, maybe, I mean, it gets us to maybe the very last thing I want to talk about, which is how do you think our job on a day-to-day basis, or not our job, but like the job of physician on a day-to-day basis is going to be different because of AI, whether it's ChatGPT or the next thing in the pipeline? For like 5 years from now, is our job going to look more or less the same, like with our interactions with patients in the hospital and the clinic? About 10 years, 20 years? I mean, I feel like as the elder among the three of us, I feel like I'm pretty safe. Like I think by the time I'm ready to retire, I don't know if medicine's going to be like completely different, but for someone who's just starting medical school now, right, who's going to be still practicing in 40 years, is their job going to look remotely the same, or is it going to look very different because of where this technology is going?
Well, maybe I can go first. I think the good news is that a lot of these things, because of how slow adopting healthcare systems are, right, it's going to be more iterative. It's not going to be alarming and like, oh, a med student reporting as a new resident and so like, oh, guys, everything that you learn is thrown out, right? Here's, I don't know, this AI chatbot, here's this robot, here are these things, drones that can send me. I don't think it's going to look like that drastic of a change, right? I think more likely is that things are going to be rolled out in a sort of incremental fashion. So already today, I know a lot of colleagues, they're using stuff like open evidence to review guidelines. And hey, what is that, right? It's just a better way of using up-to-date, right? Or sort of encyclopedia Google or ambient tools, right? That again fits very nicely and organically in, which is why all these companies have gone so quick in terms of adoption, right?
Yeah, I think I have a more a more doomsday vision. I think I appreciate that, Ethan, but I do think just it's moving so fast. I think that when I'm still a physician, but maybe later in my career, I think things are going to look really different. I think it's hard to say exactly what, but I think that it will be inconceivable to not be using AI tools as a part of your clinical practice, because it will be the new standard of care. I think, that will be complicated if we get too much model collapse, because, but we'll see where things go with, how information, like how the LLMs are trained and on what information. And I think, I hope that LLMs won't just be used and AI won't just be used in the cognitive sphere, though it's shown that it can do so much there, but that it can also be used to smooth some of these bumps in the system that mean we have less time to spend with patients to listen to them. So that's my hope, but I'm worried that it will be something that is like a new part of our jobs, but that is a pretty big burden and makes the kind of training that we've gone through seem less important because it can be trained pretty freely to do the job of physicians. I will say that I think there's a difference between getting information that you need and being in the room with somebody, like you said, Ethan, or talking to somebody who here's what you're saying, here's your pain, and they might not even know the answer, but can walk you through what can be done next. And I think that sort of human-to-human interaction, that's existed for thousands and thousands of years. That's not going to go away. But how we deliver that and who delivers that, I think is going to change a lot.
Bothie, I think something you said about training and emphasis, right? I suspect that, hey, possibly, interns, residents, med curriculum, right? The emphasis might be different. I think back in my days, I was still like, hey, memorize all this DNA pathways and things like that. It was like torture, right? But possibly there might be less, moving forward of an emphasis on rote memory, ingesting all this data because, hey, computers can always do that way better, right? While allowing that you need some sort of foundation knowledge, right, to synthesize, appreciate, a lot of this disease and treatment. And I almost think of it as like, hey, probably, right, highly likely there was a day before calculators were invented, right? There was highly likely a lot more emphasis, right, on how to do like manual calculations and stuff like that. Whereas now, like, look, the reality is like, just use a calculator, right? And very much you would be expected to use one instead of having to understand how to do very, very hard sort of summation calculation. So
Yeah, the way I've heard it described by someone was that the role of the doctor, in future decades is going to be as an empathetic communicator and no longer as a diagnostician or someone that has like encyclopedic knowledge. Like that's going to be irrelevant. And really just being able to connect with people and communicate with them and educate them is going to be even more highly valued than it is currently, which isn't good or bad. It's just, I think it's going to change what it means to be a physician. I think what would be interesting to see is if it changes, like how it changes training, do we still have to memorize those biochemical pathways that Ethan was alluding to, or is that just going to be like, we have to have some basic foundational knowledge, just to have some idea of like how the body works, but like the level of detail that we need to understand might be way less. And in exchange, we might just have to be trained to be much better communicators, which I think has been a slow trend over the last like 20 or 30 years. Has been that way. Now that, we can just log on to the computer and look up a lot of things like drug dosages or, how preferred diagnostic testing. Like we can just do that at our fingertips now. Whereas like 20 years ago, that was not necessarily the case. But whether or not like AI is going to just super accelerate that phenomenon of what skills are most prized in a physician.
To push back for 1 second, I completely agree, but I will say that the exponential increase in medical knowledge, I think means that people have, it's not, at least currently, doctors aren't memorizing less than they were, in the 1950s. And in fact, it's just like he said like now we have to understand how DNA, pathways work and like what are all the genes that we know are associated with breast cancer. And so this combination effect of the exponential increase in information and then being a user who can understand where the information that you need is sort of already what is like now the job of the doctor, which I think will be accelerated by these really powerful tools. And then the question of who is the communicator? Like, is that even a doctor in the same way we think of it now, or is it going to be an entirely different job?
All really great questions. I'm super happy to have you guys' perspectives, complementary perspectives. I look forward to additional great work that's coming from you guys and from our Rise network, and maybe we can have you back on to talk about it then. As an epilogue to this video, I'm going to very briefly discuss one more paper, a preprint that was posted online in December. Now, I wasn't personally involved with this paper, but many of our co-authors and Arise network scientists were. It hasn't been published yet, but I anticipate it will be soon. This paper sought to analyze the performance of OpenAI's O1 preview model, which was released in September 2024. The details of how O1 differs from previous forms of ChatGPT is beyond the scope of this discussion. But in extreme brief, O1 uses something called chain of thought reasoning, which in theory should improve its ability to replicate human clinical reasoning. For this paper, rather than recruiting new human subjects and designing all new experiments, the authors used methodology and data from prior studies with which they had been involved, including the 2 studies I've focused on today. They used O1 alone in the same tasks and graded it according to the same standards as before. When looking at O1's performance on diagnostic reasoning, it looked like it was substantially better than any of the prior groups, including GPT-4 alone. But when analyzed using a linear mixed effects model, it was apparently not statistically different. On the management paper, however, O1's performance was more impressive, clearly outperforming physicians, AI alone, and physicians using AI. O1 also outperformed GPT with solving New England Journal CPCs and was roughly similar to GPT-4 in probabilistic reasoning before and after a diagnostic test in a hypothetical situation, though both models outperformed humans on both of those tasks. So in short, these AI tools are still improving. I've heard people in the AI community say that we should eventually see diminishing returns from using the same general approach to generative AI and LLMs. Maybe it's because O1 is fundamentally different than GPT-4, but it doesn't seem like improvements are tapering off quite yet, at least not for tasks related to clinical reasoning. So where do we go from here? The Arise group has more projects in the works. The key questions now for our group and for others working in this space. Why are humans plus AI not better than either alone for these tasks? How can we make the combination better, for example, with more dedicated training of humans in how to optimally use the AI, or changing the AI user interface to be optimized for use in clinical medicine? How good is AI at clinical reasoning when, instead of being given a clinical vignette, it's presented with either a transcript of a physician-patient interaction or when the AI interacts directly with the patient? And more philosophical and ethical than scientific, is there a point at which the AI alone outperforms the human alone to such an extent on very specific tasks that we as a society are comfortable relinquishing some degree of human oversight of AI on those tasks? Despite being involved in this work, I am not a techno-optimist. I am not convinced that human oversight of AI in medicine will be superfluous within my lifetime. But there are plenty of people who think that day is coming soon. If we don't anticipate it and preemptively discuss it as a society, the people in control of our healthcare systems and the software companies will be deciding for us, and neither physicians nor patients want that. There is one final point, and it may be the most important point about all of this. When clinicians see the results of studies like ours and see that a general use chatbot can outperform them in some routine tasks, some of them feel discouraged or even threatened. Like, what's the point of having studied all this information in med school if a computer can seemingly now do tasks, some tasks that is, better than us, and in seconds? And will the incorporation of tools like this into clinical medicine erode our critical thinking skills as we outsource them to computers? Rather than feel discouraged, I choose to see this as an opportunity. It is motivation to improve ourselves and our teaching of clinical reasoning. Most med schools don't really teach clinical reasoning as a specific discipline of its own, and instead they fool themselves into believing they do by incorporating clinical vignettes, illness scripts, and rudimentary differential diagnosis into other more traditional components of the curriculum, like superficially talking about a patient case in a pathology or microbiology course. But clinical reasoning can be so much richer a subject if one goes beyond the basics and really leans into its complexity, including the psychology behind cognitive biases, probability and statistics, and even how game theory can inform clinical decision-making. If we as clinicians want to stay one step ahead of our future AI overlords for another few years, we must get better ourselves. I'm not ready to outsource my thinking to a computer, and I don't want you to do that either.